Lisa Marrack with us today. She grew up in Hawaii and spent 8 years working for the National Park Service in Hawaii. She has a master's in marine science from Moss Landing Marine Lab in Monterey Bay, and she's currently a PhD candidate at University of California, Berkeley in their Environmental Science Policy and Management program. And with that, I will turn it over to Lisa. Hopefully you can all see her PowerPoint on your screens at home. She's going to be talking to us about predicting the effects of sea level rise and introduced species on Hawaiian. I'm going to mispronounce it. How do you say it, Lisa? Anchialine pools? Okay, yeah, I'll turn it over to you at this point, and everybody, I hope you guys enjoy the webinar.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Jim. Really appreciate you putting this together. And I see Corbett and Angie are on, and hi, guys. You've helped in different ways with this, so it's been really exciting to be able to continue my work in Hawaii on these pools while I've been here at Berkeley. And so this is going to be sort of a summary of work that I have done and that's ongoing, and I would appreciate any feedback or questions, I guess at the end or after this. So let's see, I'm going to advance here my PowerPoint. Anchialine pools, anchios is actually a Greek term that refers to brackish. And anchialine pools are brackish pools that are in porous bedrock, like lava and limestone. They're tidally influenced, and they're actually found around the world. And in Hawaii, what you have is very porous lava that groundwater is flowing through and mixing with a marine lens. They do move up and down with the tide. And the animals that live in them, actually the shrimp and the mollusks and other species, they have larvae that can move through this porous bedrock, through the cracks and crevices of the lava, even between islands. If you look at this picture, this is actually KAHO and Kona, and it's a thermal infrared image showing you the colder water in blue, which is fresh water. And it's that groundwater that's flowing through the porous bedrock, out through the fish ponds and the anchialine pools, which you can't really see in this image, out over the coral reefs. What's interesting here is we can think of these coastal pools, these brackish pools, as a window into the groundwater that you see flowing out here. And this is just some of the different pools that I've been to. Again, you're sort of a window into that groundwater. And as such, I think of them in some ways as a canary in a coal mine, thinking about when we're thinking about groundwater quantity and quality. But there's very special communities and ecosystems within these pools. These are actually endemic Hawaiian species that you see here. Endemic damselfly, that it's a candidate endangered species. This is a candidate endangered shrimp that is a carnivore. And here you have these dominant grazers, these little Halocaridina rubra shrimp, which I'll be talking about more. They're a dominant grazer in the system, and they're thought to keep the pools clear of algae by grazing through them. This is actually an unidentified mollusk that we found at Kahakai while I was there. And then this actually shrimp is only found in a few places on the Hawaiian Islands in these anchialine pools, but it is found elsewhere, such as in Japan. This is another very rare shrimp only found in Hawaii to date in a few places, so very interesting communities. I'm not going to play the video here. You can go to this YouTube if you like later, but you can see the density of these little grazing shrimp that are the dominant grazer in the system. And they are moving in between pools, underground, hypogeally, and very important for the system because they're thought to keep the macroalgae from overgrowing some areas. This is work from Scott Santos. It's some population genetic work looking at lineages of those little grazing shrimp. And each color here shows a different genetic lineage of the shrimp. And really my point here is that the larva can move between islands or underground, and so you see that there's different lineages represented by each color on different islands and even between islands. And it's thought that this here might be a barrier, some kind of underground lava barrier, or maybe there's offshore currents that are keeping the larvae from moving very easily between these two populations at the south end of the island. So kind of an interesting genetic story there. These pools are actually very important cultural resources as well. This is Kalohikohonokohau National Park. The people, the thousands of Hawaiians that lived here pre-contact with Westerners, use these, we know, for drinking water, for bathing in some cases, for watering crops in this very arid landscape. And the shrimp were actually used for an offshore fishing as well. Today, the threats to the pools are very similar to coastal ecosystems elsewhere. Coastal development is an important consideration when thinking about conserving the pools. Groundwater quality and quantity is important. Introduced species are a threat, and sea level rise. And I'll be talking about these last two. But you can see these are two developments in Kona area, and you can see that in terms of planning, you don't have to be very far back from these pools when you're building a development. And that's something that we need to think about in terms of conserving the ecosystem. So the introduced species I'll be talking about today that I'm studying are the tilapia, which was brought in the 40s. Facelids such as guppies and mosquito fish are also been placed in the pools. These were brought in the 20s into Hawaii for mosquito control. And then macrobrachium lar, which is the Tahitian prawn, which was introduced by the state as a potential food item. The tilapia and facelids have been shown worldwide to really affect ecosystems because they add to sedimentation, in some cases nutrient loading. In the case of our pools, we have very good evidence that they're eating the dominant grazer. And so I've been drilling into this question here because before I start overlaying sea level rise, I wanted to understand, and I'm trying to understand the real effect that these introduced species have on the pools today. So the main questions I want to talk about today are what are the current effects of introduced species on the endemic anchialine pool communities? So that's sort of what role are they playing today? And then looking into the future, how will sea level rise affect future pool locations and introduced species distribution? So to start with, the Big Island is a big island, and there's some smaller parks here on the west side that are historical sites of great importance: Pu'ukohola, Kalohikohonokohau, and Pu'uhonua. There's also Hawaii Volcanoes, which is a larger park. And then this very new historic trail, which you all probably know of, but some people don't, even that live on the island. It's a 175-mile historic trail, and it encompasses a huge number of the anchialine pools. So back in the 70s, the red points represent locations that an early survey effort by Masiolik and Brock went through and just looked at the habitat, some real basic water issues or measurements. The Park Service then, starting in 2001 with Laura Schuster, began to look at the pools and the condition of the habitat. And so I was a part of that at Kalohikohonokohau, and what I decided for this project was to go back. In the last 2 summers, I've been trying to survey as many pools as I can using the Park Service sort of inventory techniques to look at abiotic and biotic features. And the last 2 summers, I've visited 375 pools. Some of them have actually never been recorded in terms of surveys, and some haven't been revisited since the 70s. And again, this is some of the variety you see. Some are 100% rock, no vegetation. Some have this really interesting microbial orange crust that's associated with the pools in Hawaii. And some are 100% sediment with different amounts of native or introduced vegetation around them. So it's looking at water parameters, vegetation indices, as well as what native and introduced animals were there. And this has given me a good idea of the basic habitat. For example, in all these plots on the x-axis, we have pools that have no apparent native shrimp. And I will say these were one-time visits in some cases. Sometimes they were 2 or 3 visits. So it's not, they may be there at some times. But so we have the none is where we don't see those 2 red shrimp. The middle group, the Halocaridina, has the little grazing shrimp that you see here in the picture. And then the Halocaridina and Metabateus glohina have both the Canada endangered shrimp as well as the Grazer. And you can see that they have a broad temperature regime. Salinities of the pools that you find both the animals in go from 2 part per thousand up to 28 part per thousand. And there's different amounts of vegetation associated with these. So this is just to give you an idea of the kind of information that I'm getting from my surveys. But what I wanted to focus in here was the effect of introduced species on our native shrimp. And so this plot is showing you the instance or the occurrence of the little grazing shrimp, Halocaridina rubra, in orange. And then the blue are pools that you don't see the shrimp in. And this category, these are all the pools that have not had introduced species seen in them. And again, I'm talking about the fish and the prawn. And so in the pools that don't have introduced species, you see a predominant number have shrimp. Some don't. And again, I suspect if I went back at other times, the shrimp might be there. In terms of pools that have the introduced fish, I see actually a much greater number don't have the native shrimp. So they're basically eating the shrimp or chasing them away. And the same goes for the introduced prawn. But to drill in a little deeper, I couldn't do this for all pools, but I was able to do night and day surveys and do some quantifying, because the previous stuff was just presence-absence information. So using a small quadrat, a 15 centimeter square quadrat, I went back to pools night and day. And what you see for the first, I'm trying to use my pointer here, for the Pacillid group, the guppies, you see during the day in light blue here, you actually do see some shrimp, some of the grazing shrimp during the day. But at nighttime, when you go back, there's a lot more. And this is because the guppies and mosquito fish are actually sleeping at night, and so the shrimp come out to play. In the tilapia pools, though, you don't see any shrimp during the day typically, or if you do, it's just one. And then at nighttime, there are some, but they tend to be in very shallow areas, 3 centimeters of water. So the tilapia seem to be having a much bigger effect on the presence or absence of the native grazer shrimp. And then skipping over here to pools where there are no introduced fish, you see that there's pretty even number of shrimp during the day and night. So the take home here is that the shrimp are coming out, they're there, but they're only coming out at night, and this may have impacts on the grazing, of course it would, and macroalgae accumulation potentially in the future, especially if nutrients were added to the system. So I'm trying to spend a lot more time in the future looking at these interactions, but I just wanted to touch on this and show that there is an effect of these introduced species in the pools. So now we're going to move on to the second question. How will sea level rise affect future pool locations and the distribution of introduced species in these pools? One reason I wanted to do this is you see here in these developments, the pools are protected somewhat. However, you can see these hard edges where you have a wall and a house just within 10 feet of an incline pool here. And here you have a large pool system that's a conservation area, but again, you have development around it. There's a lot of coastline in Hawaii where there isn't development yet, and we'd like to project where are the new pools going to occur so that we can keep development from happening on this potential new habitat. So this was kind of my driving goal behind this part of the project. So I'm sure you know that sea level is expected to rise, and the projections here are between 0.75 to almost 2 meters by the year 2100. When we look at what has been observed in the Pacific, this is actually Topex Poseidon data trends from between 1992 to 2010, and this is a change in average sea level height during that time frame in millimeters a year. And the red are areas where there has been a greater amount of sea level rise observed, so in the western Pacific. Hawaii has a little bit lower observed sea level rise, so down in the 1 millimeter, 1.5 millimeter a year. However, down here you can see that at the Kahakai tide gauge, which is a local tide gauge on the Big Island, there's actually been a measured 3.4 millimeters a year of sea level rise. And if you incorporate the fact that the island is a new lava island and it is slowly subsiding, this has been measured by geologists there, we see that, the sea level rise is occurring at kind of the global average rate on the Big Island. Now there's uncertainty with sea level rise. The big range here has to do with, we don't know exactly what, how much fossil fuel will be burnt in the future. There's some differences with tectonics and ocean ENSO and other oceanic, other oceanic processes. So we sort of have a range, but basically we can guess it. We're going to have about a 0.5 meter sea level rise by 2050. And between 1 to 2 meter rise by 2100. So for these sea level rise models, my first approach was to use what's being used by a lot of folks. It's called the bathtub model. And basically you have your digital elevation models, which on the Big Island I have a FEMA LIDAR data set that I've had access to, which has an average point distance of 1 meter. So it's very fine scale topography we can make from this. And then we have our different scenarios that we're going to be modeling, 0.5 meter, 1 meter, up to 2 meter range. And then we can look at different tide ranges as well. The one thing about these, what are called bathtub models, is that they don't include factors like erosion, which obviously occurs, especially during extreme wave events. For example, here, this is a resort on the Kona coast. And this occurred during the tsunami that happened in Japan. And you can see that there was a sand berm, and the one event blew through this berm. So the sea level rise models that are bathtub are just incrementally raising the ocean surface and don't account for these big wave events. However, because incline pools are set back from the shoreline, and because they're in bedrock, erosion and extreme wave events don't necessarily have as big an impact as groundwater. And so that's a third factor I have in here. And so I've begun to incorporate groundwater into my models. And just as kind of a quick tangent here, because I think it's really important in modeling sea level rise in coastal areas, and in particular these pools. In Hawaii and in many other Pacific islands, you have this very porous bedrock. And this little cartoon represents what you see on these islands where you have sea level here in the ocean, but then you have groundwater that is perched above that. So when sea level rises, whether it's during the daily tides or as this progressive sea level rise we're expecting, the fresher, less dense groundwater floats above that rising marine lens. And your wells or your pools will actually fill as well. And so this, of course, causes saltwater intrusion, but it may cause pools to move inland as sea levels rise. So in Hawaii, in fact, on the west coast, this is Kolokohonokohau National Historic Park. These squares here represent places where the USGS has monitored every 10 minutes sea level rise. Not sea level rise, I'm sorry. They've measured groundwater height every 10 minutes. And so using that, I've been able to pull out data to show, first of all, that just like our model, our little cartoon showed, we have really, we have tidal action. And this isn't a new thing. This is something Diel and others have shown on the Big Island. But this right here, this blue dot, I'm using my cursor as a pointer. This blue dot is actually an incline pool that sits about 100 meters inshore of the coast. And you can see that we have semi-diurnal tides being experienced in that pool. over a kilometer inland, there's a well up here that actually is also undergoing that semi-diurnal tide. So number one, this does show us that there is an unconstrained aquifer here, and that as sea level rises, we should see a rise in these pools. But the data also gives us mean groundwater heights above sea level, above mean sea level. And so what I've done, and this actually I just had a paper accepted for the Journal of Coastal Research, but this is this plot here shows you if you go in from shore, from 0 meters, this is shoreline, and you move inshore, and then you look at groundwater heights, we can actually plot, these are the actual wells from the USGS data, the mean groundwater height over sea level, and then we create a linear model to show what that shape of that water table should be. And I've used that in GIS format to create groundwater heights above sea level. And I've been able to use that to test and see if we add groundwater into our sea level models, are we able to detect known pools, current pools better? And yes, just as expected, we're much better at detecting current pools now if we include this groundwater model. So what does that mean for projecting sea level rise into the future? Well, we can add in groundwater into the models and do a much better job of predicting sea level rise effects on pools into the future. So at KAHO, for example, these yellow dots all represent anchialine pools that we've mapped on the ground. Sally Beavers there at KAHO has been a big part of this. And we have mapped the current pools. This is current sea level on the left. And then on the right side, I've put in these different sea level models, rising in half-meter increments. And we can see with increasing increments of sea level rise at an extreme tide, more and more of these pools are inundated. And so 53% of all the pools at KAHO become inundated at a 1 meter sea level rise at mean high or high water. And at the 2 meter sea level rise at an extreme tide, almost all, 97% of current pools become inundated. So that can sound a little depressing if you're trying to conserve a coastal habitat. But what I really like to stress is that not only do we cover current habitat, we actually create new habitat. And luckily at these places where our coastal areas aren't developed in a national park, we have places for this habitat to migrate to. So these orange areas represent new pool habitat that will form in the porous basalt. And so we can use these projections up and down the coast to think about areas we shouldn't build on, that we should protect. The other cool thing, you may remember that I mentioned the native species actually have larvae that move underground in the groundwater or through the ocean. These, we know that the native fauna will be able to populate the new habitats. This is exciting. Now the bad news is that our introduced species may also disperse. And so I'm going to focus here on the fishes. One reason is that the fishes move overland. They don't move hypogeally, at least as far as we've been able to see, like the native shrimp. And so as sea levels rise, the introduced fishes like tilapia and guppies will be able to move into new habitats, especially at higher tides. And so what I'm working on now is actually modeling this. And what I'd like to do is just give you an idea of my thought process, and I'd love to get feedback on this at some point. But this represents a complex of pools that we know exist today. The green ones all have the native shrimp in them, and they do not have any introduced species. This red pool here does have introduced guppies, and today they've been there for quite a while, and they haven't spread into other pool complexes. If we have the 1 meter sea level rise, this is just at a slack tide at mean sea level, we see that we have new habitat that forms, and we also have a connection between the pool with guppies and pools that don't have them. And so potentially the introduced fish will be able to spread into new habitat. This is a 1 meter sea level rise, so the same sea level rise but at a mean higher high water, so at high tide. And you can see much more of these pools are connected, and of course there is the possibility for these guppies to spread into new habitats. It may not all happen in one day, of course, but over time. And then this is the extreme annual tide, a tide we may have once a year. That there's a high connectivity between all of these pools. So that when we get back down to the slack tide or the mean sea level, most of these pools could potentially be infected with the introduced fish. So I'm going to go back here. What I'm working on now is actually working on modeling this in several different conservation areas up and down the Kahakai Trail, and potentially using some connectivity tools that are used by other types of land management groups. And so I would love to talk to anyone who does this sort of work. So what this can do, these sorts of maps can help us to figure out where do we want to do fish removals. And for sure, we would want to target this pool that was the original infector. That would be a pool that we definitely want to get rid of fish. And so there's different ways that we've been working with. Anne Grazer from the USGS has been exploring using electroshock to remove fish. She just was there last week trying out CO2 bubbling, which drops the pH level of pools and allows you to collect the fish easier. There's also some native plants that traditionally have been used to stun fish, and several people are looking at the possibility of using this. Rotenone has been useful in the past, but it's not allowed anymore. The EPA has decided it's too dangerous because it may flow out onto the reefs. The one thing that we have seen in very small examples, when you do get rid of the fish, the shrimp come right back. And so, especially because they're coming back at night in many of these systems, we think there's a really good potential for restoration of these ecosystems if we can get rid of the introduced fishes. One last thing I'd like to highlight here is the importance of marginal sites. And I think, people working with climate change projections are realizing that places that are maybe marginal habitat right now may actually be really important habitat in the future. And the way this plays out in my system that I'm working on is in this example. You have these 3 pools right next to each other in the lava, and these 2 pools actually go dry at low tide, whereas this pool on the right does not. It has water in it all the time. And so what you see is that the pool on the right, you actually have guppies in it, and you rarely see shrimp during the daytime. But over on these 2, during the daytime, you see lots and lots of the grazing shrimp. And so these pools, you may go out and see the ones that go dry at low tide and think, oh, these aren't important because they're not really full of water all the time. Well, actually, in terms of the habitat for these native shrimp, they're almost more important than the one that stays full all the time. And these will become, as sea level rise, more important habitat in the future. So I've been speaking pretty fast. I realize I was trying to keep this to 40 minutes, but I've sort of blazed through everything. I guess that will leave time for questions. But really important here for me is that, there sort of had been this word of mouth, people talking about how the introduced species are impacting the endemic shrimp. And the data that I've been collecting up and down the coast is showing that. But there's some nuances to it. Because, for example, the guppies don't seem to have as big an impact as the tilapia. And if we go back at night, actually the native species are there. Also, sea level rise, although it will inundate new habitat, it will inundate current habitat, it is creating new habitat inland, and so we should protect those areas. Introduced species will disperse due to sea level rise, and we can use this information in these maps to target removal efforts. Also, I think it's very important here that groundwater should be included in sea level rise models. Because actually, as sea levels rise, the groundwater is going to cause even more inundation than we expect. And finally, I'd just like to say that one thing that Kahakai is doing is they're making I've done sea level rise models for the entire Kahakai trail here, and we're making these models available for the community and government so that they can use them for planning into the future. And so we've been trying to do a lot of community outreach. We went and talked to the county planners as well as public groups to let them know this information is available and how it could be used. Because what really we want to do is avoid this sort of situation where as sea levels rise, this pool system will have nowhere to move to, essentially. So again, here we have the Kahakai Trail out in a part of state conservation land. We have a lava that's very pitted, very porous, and what we'd like to do is protect these areas for future pool complexes and highlight the importance of this to the general public. So there's a lot of people to thank that have been helping me, and there's more people that aren't even on here. Angie, I'd like to thank you for all your help, but really there's just a lot of people, and I'd like to open it up for questions.
Okay, thanks very much, Lisa. Very interesting research that you're doing there. And if people do have questions, there's a question box, and you can type those in. Lisa, I'll share with you a couple things I learned through the box. One is that in the Pacific West region, there was sort of an emergency all-employee meeting called at the same time as this webinar, so that may be why we didn't see as many people from Pacific West, and there's not much we can do about that. But
well, that's fine.
So yeah, I'm sorry that we ended up with that conflict. And there's another thank you in the question box. It just says, Lisa, thank you. This is really great research. I'll share it with the I&M aquatic or aqua folks, and hopes that staff will get a chance to see this presentation at the Hawaii parks. And you know, there may be other opportunities for you to present it directly, but just so everyone knows, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the Ocean Alaska Science and Learning Center website, which is www.oceanalaska.org.
Yeah, well, one thing I would like to mention is the I&M group, incline pools have been, there is an I&M protocol for incline pools that's being developed, and they've included a few pools in their kind of water quality monitoring as well. So the group that are up in Hawaii Volcano, they've been going to some of these pools for a couple years now. And Sally Beavers has been doing work on them for a while, so I definitely want to do a shout out to them too.
Great. Well, I do have a couple of questions here for you, Lisa, in the question box. One is sort of a comment for discussion, I think. It says, I would warn against assuming that poselids will or do not disperse through underground routes. Some species of poselid are prolific in cave ecosystems.
Yeah, I do know that they have dispersed in caves, and what's interesting is it does seem like, at least in some of these areas, that they become confined to one area. And then there was that one example I showed you at Koloko where they have been in this one pool for at least as long as I've known, so since 2001, and they haven't moved anywhere else. So it probably really depends on how big the cracks and crevices are in nearby.
Okay, great. And another question is, how might changes in temperature and or pH affect the responses of the native and introduced species to sea level rise?
That is a really good question. I am collecting data on pH every time I go to one of these pools. Potentially, you could see an effect, especially on the mollusks. Some of these teeny tiny mollusks that I showed you. Let me just get to the image of it. You know, this thing is only a couple millimeters across, so you would potentially see a change in that. I don't know a lot about the effect.
Could you repeat that? I think we lost your audio for a second. I don't know.
Oh, I don't know how rising CO2 is going to affect the acidity of groundwater, but I would expect it would be similar to marine settings. So little snails like this one that have very thin shells, it's only a few millimeters across, could be affected by it. That's a really good question.
Well, it's good to know that that is a parameter that you're collecting data on as well, and so that, you know, a baseline is being established so that the trend can be monitored there as well.
I will say with the temperature and salinity, the plots, I just threw up a few plots of kind of the variability of the habitat, and you know, the salinities that they're living within, this is salinity down here, are from 2 to 28 parts per thousand, and that's within pools across a very large area. But even in one pool, as the day goes on, there usually is a little bit saltier area below and a fresher area above in terms of the water column in some pools. Temperature also can change quite a bit throughout the day because of the heating of the black lava. The groundwater is pretty cool itself, but the shallower pools get warm. So while the native species are probably adapted fairly well to some variability, we don't have a great handle on what their extreme limits are at all. That would be good to look into.
Okay, and it looks like that's it. Well, there's another question. When will the recorded version be available? That's from Corbett Nash, and I will certainly send you an email. I try to get these available within a few days, and sometimes it happens, and sometimes it slips off the radar to more like within a week or so, but I'll shoot you an email when that's available.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, Corbett or anyone else, this is ongoing. Some of these plots I just was able to finish this week because I have new data that has just come in, so it's sort of ongoing. So if you're interested in, you know, me talking to INM or anyone else, there may be some updates, so just let me know, and I'd be happy to do another one.
All right. Well, great. Thank you so much, Lisa, for taking time out of your day to present this to us and taking time to get it all ready. We appreciate it, and glad you could be part of the ongoing POET webinar series. As I said at the beginning, we do have webinars tentatively planned for October. That one will be on a Thursday. It would be October 24th. Our November webinar will be moved up by a week because of Thanksgiving, and will most likely occur on November 21st. But just stay tuned to your email, and we'll send out definite notice when those are confirmed. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.